The morning of December 8, 1941, broke over the Pacific with the thunder of Japanese carrier-based bombers raining destruction upon Pearl Harbor, and in the smoke and chaos of that Sunday attack, a new chapter in naval warfare began, not with the roar of battleship guns, but with the silent descent of American submarines slipping beneath the waves to hunt an empire that believed itself invincible. In the officers' clubs of Tokyo and the naval headquarters at Truk Lagoon, Japanese admirals raised glasses in celebration, confident that their combined fleet would sweep the Americans from the Pacific in a matter of months. And when discussions turned to the threat posed by enemy submarines, laughter often followed because, to the Imperial Navy's leadership, submarines were relics of the last war, slow and clumsy instruments suited only for coastal defense and reconnaissance, not the decisive weapon of modern conflict. Their doctrine emphasized the grand surface engagement, the clash of battleships and carriers where honor and firepower would determine victory. And in this vision, there was no room for vessels that hid beneath the surface like cowards, striking from darkness rather than facing their enemy in the light of day. The Americans possessed fewer than 200 operational submarines at the war's outbreak, most of them older designs with limited range and reliability, and Japanese intelligence reports dismissed them as minimal threats to the vast convoy system that would feed the empire's expansion across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, a network of tankers and freighters carrying oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina, and iron ore from the Philippines to sustain the war machine that Tokyo believed would dominate the hemisphere for generations. The mockery was not confined to private conversations, but appeared in official assessments and training manuals that characterized American submariners as inexperienced and psychologically unsuited for prolonged underwater operations, lacking the warrior spirit that defined the Imperial Japanese Navy. And this contempt was reinforced by early patrol results that seemed to confirm every prejudice, because in the opening months of the war, American submarines returned from patrols with dismal success rates, torpedoes that ran too deep or failed to detonate even when they struck their targets squarely, and commanders who approached enemy convoys with excessive caution, haunted by peacetime training that emphasized boat preservation over aggressive action. Japanese convoy captains steamed across the Pacific with minimal escort, sometimes only a single aging destroyer or patrol boat accompanying a half-dozen merchantmen loaded with critical supplies. And when reports reached Tokyo of submarine contacts, the response was often bureaucratic indifference because the threat seemed manageable, even trivial compared to the grand campaigns unfolding across the theater. And this attitude would persist through 1942 and into the first half of 1943, a fatal period during which the Imperial Navy failed to recognize that beneath the surface a transformation was underway that would ultimately strangle the empire more effectively than any fleet of battleships could achieve. If stories like this captivate you, consider subscribing and tell us where you're watching from. It really helps us bring more stories like this your way. The transformation began not in the corridors of Naval Command, but in the cramped control rooms and torpedo compartments of submarines operating thousands of miles from home, where crews confronted the bitter reality that their primary weapon was fundamentally flawed, a truth that senior officers in Washington initially refused to accept, despite mounting evidence from commanders filing patrol reports filled with accounts of torpedoes that ran beneath targets without exploding or detonated prematurely before reaching their aim. The Mark 14 torpedo, standard armament for the American submarine force, suffered from a magnetic exploder mechanism that proved unreliable in the Pacific's varying magnetic fields, and a contact exploder that often failed upon impact because it had never been adequately tested under realistic combat conditions, and the Bureau of Ordnance defended its design with institutional arrogance, dismissing field complaints as operator error and refusing to authorize the comprehensive testing that would have revealed the flaws earlier. Submarine commanders found themselves in an impossible position, ordered to prosecute aggressive warfare against Japanese shipping while equipped with weapons that betrayed them at the critical moment, and the frustration built with each patrol as skippers watched through periscopes while perfectly aimed torpedoes passed harmlessly beneath enemy hulls, or struck amidships without detonating, wasting opportunities that had required hours of dangerous stalking and positioning to achieve. Some commanders began deactivating the magnetic exploders on their own authority, violating official policy but improving results, and gradually the accumulated weight of evidence forced the Bureau of Ordnance to acknowledge the problems and authorize modifications, but this process consumed more than 2 years during which countless enemy ships escaped destruction, and American submarines operated at a fraction of their potential effectiveness, giving the Japanese Navy false confidence that its convoy system was adequate and that the submarine threat remained manageable within existing defensive frameworks. While the torpedo crisis slowly resolved through field modifications and bureaucratic acceptance, Another transformation was occurring in the command culture of the submarine force, as cautious peacetime officers were replaced by aggressive younger commanders, willing to close to point-blank range and press attacks even under heavy counterfire from escorts. Men whose names would become legendary within the silent service and whose tactics would rewrite the doctrine of submarine warfare. Lieutenant Commander Dudley Morton, known universally as Mush, took command of the USS Wahoo in early 1943 and immediately demonstrated a radically different approach, bringing his boat to the surface during attacks to maximize speed and maneuverability, engaging targets with deck guns when appropriate, and pursuing damaged vessels with relentless determination until they sank, an aggressive philosophy that infected the entire submarine force as Morton's spectacular success became known throughout the fleet. His executive officer, Richard O'Kane, absorbed these lessons and would later command the USS Tang with even greater effectiveness, sinking more enemy tonnage per patrol than any other American submarine commander and pioneering night surface attacks that exploited the submarine's low profile and superior radar to approach convoys undetected, firing spreads of torpedoes at close range before enemy escorts could respond, then slipping away into darkness while chaos erupted behind. These men and others like them understood that submarine warfare was fundamentally about aggression tempered by calculated risk, that the psychological advantage belonged to the hunter willing to press close enough to guarantee hits, and their example inspired a generation of submarine commanders who took increasingly bold action against Japanese shipping, transforming the submarine force from a hesitant peripheral asset into the primary offensive weapon strangling Japan's maritime lifelines. The Japanese response to mounting convoy losses revealed a fundamental failure to grasp the scale and nature of the threat, because their naval doctrine had never prioritized anti-submarine warfare, viewing escort duty as unglamorous and assigning older destroyers and converted merchant vessels to convoy protection rather than developing specialized escort vessels and tactics as the British and Americans had done in the Atlantic campaign. When losses began accelerating in 1943, the Imperial Navy's response was piecemeal and inadequate, adding a few more escorts to high-value convoys and instituting routing changes that American code breakers quickly penetrated, but never implementing the comprehensive convoy system with dedicated air cover, hunter-killer groups, and coordinated defensive tactics that might have stemmed the hemorrhaging of tonnage. Part of this failure stemmed from resource constraints, as Japan's industrial capacity struggled to meet the competing demands of surface fleet maintenance, aircraft production, and Army support, leaving little capacity for building the hundreds of escort vessels that effective convoy protection would have required. But equally important was a cultural blindness within the naval leadership that continued to view surface engagement as the decisive form of warfare and convoy escort as a secondary mission unworthy of the combined fleet's attention. Intelligence reports reaching Tokyo documented increasing submarine activity and sophisticated attack patterns, but senior officers interpreted these as isolated successes rather than evidence of systematic campaign, and the administrative separation between convoy operations, naval intelligence, and fleet command prevented any unified assessment of the threat or coordinated response, ensuring that even when individual commanders recognized the danger, institutional inertia prevented effective countermeasures from being implemented across the theater. By mid-1943, American submarines were operating with increasing effectiveness as torpedo reliability improved. Aggressive commanders proliferated throughout the force, and a hidden advantage began tipping the balance decisively in favor of the hunters, because at Pearl Harbor, in a nondescript building that few outside the intelligence community knew existed, cryptanalysts had broken the Japanese naval codes and were reading enemy communications with increasing speed and accuracy. This intelligence breakthrough, codenamed Ultra in the European theater and Magic in the Pacific, provided submarine commanders with advance warning of convoy departures, routing information, and cargo manifests, allowing them to position their boats along predicted track lines days before enemy ships arrived, transforming submarine warfare from random patrol into targeted interdiction. Japanese convoy planners changed routes and schedules in response to perceived threats, unaware that every coded message they transmitted was being read in Hawaii and forwarded to submarines already adjusting their positions to intercept. And this asymmetry of information proved devastating because it multiplied the effectiveness of each submarine by ensuring that patrol time was spent in productive hunting grounds rather than empty ocean. The Japanese never suspected that their codes had been compromised on such a comprehensive scale, attributing convoy losses to bad luck, improved American tactics, and the expanding number of submarines operating in Pacific waters, and this fundamental intelligence failure compounded every other mistake in their convoy protection system, ensuring that even when they implemented defensive measures, American submarines received advance warning and adapted their tactics accordingly, staying always one step ahead of Japanese countermeasures. The year 1944 marked the transition from successful submarine campaign to systematic annihilation of Japanese merchant capacity as American industrial production delivered new fleet submarines at a rate that overwhelmed any Japanese ability to replace losses, with boats leaving West Coast shipyards at a pace of several per month, each one incorporating the latest radar, sonar, and torpedo improvements, crewed by men who had trained intensively and learned from the accumulated experience of hundreds of previous patrols. The submarine force began implementing Wolfpack tactics adapted from German U-boat operations in the Atlantic, coordinating groups of 3 or more submarines to trail and attack convoys simultaneously from multiple directions, overwhelming escorts, and ensuring that even if one boat was driven off by depth charge attack, others would press the assault until every merchant vessel was sinking or scattered. These coordinated attacks proved devastatingly effective because Japanese escorts lacked the radar and sonar sophistication to track multiple submerged contacts simultaneously, and convoy discipline often collapsed under attack from multiple directions as merchant captains broke formation and attempted individual evasion, making them easier targets for submarines that could pursue isolated vessels without interference from escorts occupied elsewhere. The Wolfpack doctrine required sophisticated communications and coordination, with one submarine often serving as shadower to track the convoy and radio position reports, while others maneuvered for attack positions. And the successful execution of these tactics demonstrated the organizational maturity and technological advantage that American submarines had achieved, operating as a coordinated fleet rather than individual boats conducting independent patrols. The psychological impact on Japanese merchant marine personnel became a factor by late 1944 as survival rates plummeted and crews began refusing assignments on routes known to be heavily targeted by American submarines, particularly the critical oil tanker, runs from the Dutch East Indies to the home islands that sustained Japanese naval operations and industrial production. Ship captains reported for duty to find their vessels undermanned as experienced sailors deserted rather than face near certain death, and some convoys departed port with hastily assembled crews of inexperienced merchant sailors, conscripted civilians, and soldiers assigned to shipboard duty as emergency replacements, none of them adequately trained for maritime operations, and all of them terrified of the invisible hunters waiting beyond the harbor. The fear was not irrational because by this stage of the war, submarines were sinking ships faster than Japanese yards could replace them, and the probability that any given merchant vessel would complete its voyage successfully had dropped below 50% on major routes, meaning that crews faced odds worse than a coin flip every time they put to sea. This collapse of morale within the merchant marine compounded the physical losses inflicted by submarines, because even ships that survived attack often arrived late with reduced cargo, as crews refused to maintain schedule, took evasive routing that added days to voyages, and in some cases abandoned ships at the first sign of submarine contact, leaving valuable vessels and cargoes adrift. The Imperial Navy attempted to address this crisis by assigning military personnel to merchant vessels and threatening deserters with execution, but no amount of coercion could restore the confidence that had been systematically destroyed by 2 years of relentless submarine warfare. And the merchant marine's declining effectiveness represented a strategic defeat, as significant as the physical tonnage being sent to the bottom. The scope of the submarine campaign's success became apparent in the statistical analysis that naval planners compiled as 1944 drew to a close, and the numbers revealed a stunning reality that less than 2% of American naval personnel, the submarine force, had accounted for more than half of all Japanese shipping destroyed during the war, a ratio of effectiveness unmatched by any other weapon system deployed in the Pacific theater. American submarines had sunk approximately 1,300 Japanese merchant vessels, totaling more than 5 million tons of shipping, along with more than 200 naval vessels, including 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, and 15 cruisers, achievements that came at the terrible cost of 52 submarines lost with their entire crews, representing the highest casualty rate of any American military service, but also demonstrating extraordinary effectiveness when measured by strategic impact per personnel committed. The Japanese merchant fleet, which had numbered more than 6 million tons at the war's beginning, was reduced to less than 2 million tons of operational shipping by the end of 1944, and this remaining tonnage was increasingly concentrated in coastal waters around the home islands, where it could receive air cover and shore-based protection because venturing into open ocean had become virtual suicide for any vessel flying the Japanese flag. The collapse of the merchant fleet created cascading effects throughout the Japanese war economy as oil refineries shut down for lack of crude petroleum, aluminum plants curtailed production for want of bauxite, steel mills closed for shortage of iron ore, and food supplies dwindled as rice imports from Southeast Asia ceased, creating the conditions for strategic defeat before the first B-29 bomber struck industrial targets in Japan proper. The human dimension of this campaign played out in thousands of individual engagements, where submarine crews executed their mission with professional efficiency while grappling with the moral weight of sending enemy sailors to their deaths, because submarine warfare allowed no opportunity for rescue or mercy. Every torpedo that struck a merchant ship condemned its crew to death by drowning, burning, or exposure in open ocean far from land. American submariners did not glory in this slaughter, but understood it as necessary to shorten the war and save American lives that would otherwise be lost in continued combat. And they prosecuted their mission with the same determined professionalism that characterized the entire American war effort, balancing the psychological burden of killing with the certainty that every ship they sank weakened the enemy's ability to continue fighting. The Japanese sailors who died in these attacks were mostly merchant seamen rather than combat personnel, men who had been conscripted into maritime service or who continued peacetime occupations that happened to occur in a war zone, and their deaths represented the brutal reality that modern industrial warfare erases distinctions between combatant and non-combatant when the entire economy becomes integrated into the war effort. Submarine commanders filing patrol reports documented these attacks with clinical precision, noting tonnage sunk and tactical details while rarely dwelling on the human cost, a psychological defense mechanism necessary to maintain operational effectiveness across multiple patrols that might each result in dozens of enemy ships destroyed and thousands of enemy personnel killed. The Japanese naval leadership's belated recognition of the submarine threat came too late to implement effective countermeasures, because by 1945, the industrial capacity and trained personnel necessary for comprehensive convoy protection no longer existed, with Japanese shipyards unable to produce escorts faster than they were being sunk, and naval aviation reduced to a fraction of its former strength, unable to provide the air cover that might have detected submarines and forced them to remain submerged, where their effectiveness dropped dramatically. The Imperial Navy attempted to concentrate remaining merchant vessels in heavily escorted convoys that remained in coastal waters, reducing risk, but also drastically cutting the volume of strategic materials reaching the home islands. And even these defensive convoys suffered attack as American submarines, grown bold from years of successful operations, penetrated coastal defense zones, and conducted attacks within sight of the Japanese shore. Some submarine commanders began laying mines in harbor approaches and narrow straits, creating additional hazards that forced remaining Japanese shipping into predictable channels where a conventional torpedo attack became easier, and the combination of mines, torpedoes, and simple statistical attrition reduced Japanese maritime capacity to the point where the empire was effectively cut off from its overseas territories, unable to exploit the resources of Southeast Asia that had been the original strategic objective of the war. Senior Japanese officers who had mocked American submarines in 1941 now confronted reports of convoys that simply disappeared, departing port and never arriving at their destinations, with no survivors recovered and no certain knowledge of what had occurred, only the grim assumption that submarines had intercepted them and sent every vessel to the bottom in attacks so swift and complete that no one escaped to report the details. The decisive turning point came not in a single dramatic engagement, but in the accumulated weight of hundreds of patrol successes that by mid-1945 had achieved what American planners termed the economic strangulation of Japan, a condition in which the home islands lacked sufficient oil to fuel the remaining naval vessels and aircraft, insufficient food to adequately supply the civilian population, and no capacity to import the industrial raw materials necessary for continued military production. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once the third largest fleet in the world, lay immobilized in harbor with empty fuel tanks, reduced to serving as floating anti-aircraft batteries defending against American bomber raids, because sortying for combat operations would exhaust the last reserves of bunker oil without accomplishing any strategic objective. Aircraft sat on runways unable to fly for lack of aviation gasoline, and the kamikaze campaign that consumed thousands of pilots and aircraft in the war's final months drew from carefully hoarded reserves that could not be replenished, because the tankers that might have brought oil from the Dutch East Indies rested on the ocean floor, torpedoed by submarines whose crews had long since moved on to new targets. The starvation of the Japanese war machine proceeded with mathematical certainty as submarine after submarine filed patrol reports documenting additional tonnage destroyed, and American intelligence analysts watching the cumulative totals climb recognized that the strategic victory had already been achieved, even though the formal surrender lay months in the future, waiting only for Japanese leadership to acknowledge what the numbers had already proven beyond dispute. The final patrols of the war saw American submarines ranging into previously forbidden waters, penetrating the sea of Japan itself through heavily mined straits that had been considered impassable, conducting offensive operations in what the Japanese had believed was their secure inner defensive zone. These audacious operations, executed with technological aids like FM sonar that could detect mines and allow submarines to navigate through defensive minefields, demonstrated the complete dominance that American submarines had achieved, operating with virtual impunity in enemy home waters, while Japanese anti-submarine forces proved incapable of preventing their infiltration or tracking their movements once inside. Submarines surfaced in daylight to bombard coastal installations with deck guns, attacked harbor facilities, and intercepted the coastal shipping that represented Japan's last maritime lifeline, and the psychological impact of these operations on Japanese morale was immense, as the civilian population confronted evidence that the Navy could no longer protect even home waters from enemy penetration. When the war ended in August 1945, following the atomic bombings and Soviet entry into the conflict, American submarines received stand-down orders while conducting offensive patrols, some of them positioned for attacks on targets that would never be prosecuted because the Emperor's surrender broadcast rendered further combat unnecessary. And in the sudden transition from war to peace, submarine crews confronted the reality that their 3.5-year campaign had been among the most strategically decisive operations of the entire Pacific War. The officers who had laughed at American submarines in 1941 found themselves in the autumn of 1945, confronting the ruins of their maritime empire. A merchant fleet reduced to barely 1 million tons of operational shipping, naval vessels rusting at anchor or sunk in harbor by American mines and air attack, and an economy so thoroughly disrupted that famine threatened millions of civilians who depended on food imports that no longer arrived. The American submarine force, which had never exceeded 300 boats operational simultaneously and had suffered the loss of 52 submarines with 3,500 men killed in action, had sunk more than 5 million tons of merchant shipping and 400,000 tons of naval vessels, achievements that represented not just tactical success, but strategic triumph, because the cumulative effect had been to sever the connections between the Japanese home islands and the empires. Resource base, rendering impossible the prolonged war of attrition that Japanese planners had hoped would exhaust American will to continue fighting. The mockery and contempt that had characterized Japanese attitudes towards submarines in the war's early years gave way to bitter recognition that they had catastrophically underestimated both the weapon system's potential and the determination of the men who operated it, a strategic blindness that contributed directly to Japan's defeat by preventing effective defensive measures from being implemented until long after the submarine campaign had achieved irreversible momentum. The lessons learned beneath the Pacific's waters transcended the specific tactical and technological details of submarine warfare to illuminate fundamental truths about innovation, adaptation, and the danger of allowing doctrine and prejudice to blind institutions to emerging threats, because the Japanese naval leadership possessed all the information necessary to recognize the submarine danger and implement effective countermeasures, but chose instead to maintain existing beliefs and priorities, until reality forced acknowledgement at a point when response was no longer possible. The transformation of the American submarine force from technically flawed and doctrinally uncertain weapon in 1941 to the most effective strategic tool of the Pacific War demonstrated the power of organizational learning and adaptation when field experience is allowed to inform doctrine and when institutional resistance to change can be overcome by accumulated evidence of success. The aggressive commanders who rewrote submarine tactics did so not through brilliant individual insight, but through systematic application of lessons learned across hundreds of patrols, adapting to enemy countermeasures and exploiting technological advantages as they became available, embodying a culture of continuous improvement that proved decisive in extended conflict. If this kind of storytelling inspires you, subscribe, leave a like, and tell us what topic you'd like to see next.